thanks everyone for signing up and for joining us to listen to this first session. So quick introduction, my name's Liam and I'm the CEO of Make CIC, which is a social enterprise based in the Liverpool City region. We have 3 creative workspaces across the region, 1 in Wirral, 2 in Liverpool, 1 of which is in the Baltic Triangle, and 1 of which is in North Docks. I also have a co-host with me today, Neve. Doesn't have the best connection, so dipping in and out of video. Neve works for Make and also runs her own events CIC called Small Steps. The purpose of these plugged in sessions was to try and do something meaningful. Initially we were sort of scrambling around for stuff to do as lockdown began, and now there's almost too much to do. These sessions were about getting people talking, and we think it's important. We did host a number of sort of conferences and little gatherings as a thing that Make does anyway. But we've picked sessions that are close to our heart, and one of them is about town centres and high streets. Close to my heart because I'm Commissioner for Town Centre along with Vidhya and Sarah. And also close to Make's heart being is town centre sort of regeneration is a big part of what we do by virtue of existing. So that's where we are, and that's why we're doing these sessions. So I've got 3 brilliant speakers to join us today to talk about COVID-19 and the response to town centres and high streets, and I'll let them do their own introductions. But Amy, who also works for Make, is in the chat, and she is copying and pasting information from their profiles and also other interesting things to click on, like our mailing list and all that sort of stuff. I think I'll start with Sarah, if that's okay.
Hi there. My name is Sarah Longlands, and I'm the director at IPPR North, the Institute of Public Policy Research. Normally, we're based in Manchester and Newcastle, but obviously we're remote working at the current time. We were set up 16 years ago, really to provide a voice for some of the policy debates in the north of England, in recognition that a lot of the debate on what government does happens at Whitehall. And there isn't a lot of discussion about how that needs to be influenced by the particular circumstances of communities in places like the north of England. The main kind of emphasis of our work at the current time has been on drawing a really strong analysis of the regional inequalities across the UK, and showing how the north of England and other regions actually of England have been have lost out in terms of investment, in terms of funding, and in terms of power, and that has consequences for their economies and for their ability to really make the most of the potential that they have. In terms of what Liam mentioned at the start, we're also involved in the Liverpool City Region Town Centres Commissions, which I chair. And that has really grown out of an interest of mine and some of my colleagues in the role of smaller and medium-sized towns and cities. And I'm making the point that we need to invest in our cities and so on. That's fine, but we also need to think about how they connect more widely to smaller towns and places, because people live there too. Businesses operate from those areas as well, and so we need to make sure that those places are properly connected up. And so we were really interested in the work that the Liverpool City Region were doing in terms of that Town Centres Commission, and the purpose of that commission, certainly pre-COVID, was, and we just started in January, but the purpose was really to come up with a new vision for town centres across the Liverpool City Region, with the dramatic impact of COVID, and I think it will be dramatic in terms of high streets and town centres. I think the purpose now is about how we actually manage the impact in town centres, and how we can really start to reinvent and rethink what will be a very disruptive phase, I think, for many town centres and high streets, and will really accelerate some of the negative trends that we saw in town centres before the crisis begun. I think on the positive, I think there's also, obviously we've had reductions in air pollution and congestion. We've also seen a real kind of burgeoning of civil society, with people really helping each other in their communities. But I think for town centres specifically, there's a real challenge in terms of how they start to adapt in a new era of social distancing, and what that means for office accommodation, but also in terms of social assets, community assets in an area, theatres, arts venues, community centres. How can they adapt to a new kind of era of social distancing? As well as, of course, some of the key infrastructure such as bus stations, train stations, and so on, and many of them will be thinking about that at the moment. I think as well, real challenges in terms of the fact that all of our worlds has shrunk so massively over the last month, and that has really drawn our attention to the importance of local places, of local communities. So I think that's it's both a negative in terms of it's a shrinking of your world, but it's also positive in terms of really strengthening the connections with community that perhaps people haven't noticed or realised previously, and that might be really important for town centres going forward. I think there's also an opportunity in terms of just thinking about the way in which this whole process has had a significant disruption in how we think about work, with a huge acceleration in terms of people working from home and working remotely. So there might also be opportunities for town centres in terms of thinking about the provision of flexible workspace and training facilities as well, in a sort of socially distanced way, because people may not want to return to business as normal. They may not want to get on trains or get on buses as they did previously. They might want to take advantage of the lessons that we've learned from this. But I think we shouldn't, I think there's a lot of potential opportunities from COVID, but we shouldn't underestimate the scale of the challenge as well. The impact for the high street and for town centres will be and is being really severe and dramatic in some places. And I think we need to face up to the question about what the role of the town centre is in the 21st century. And that's one of the questions that we're kind of grappling with in the Town Centres Commission as well. And there's also, real issues around the way in which this crisis is perhaps widening some of the social inequalities that we see in our communities. We see that in terms of those vulnerable children who haven't been able to access school, and those people who are who don't have the facilities that some others have in terms of gardens and access to green space. So I think we will need to keep an eye on some of those inequalities and really see at the end of this crisis how those inequalities have widened, and what I guess the role of town centres is in providing support to communities and helping those areas to recover. And that's about the economy, but it's also about the kind of social and civil society infrastructure that town centres will probably have to provide in the longer term. So that's some of my thoughts on the topic. I don't want to hog the space, so really happy to explore some of these issues going forward. I will just finish by saying that I think we do need to think about the town centre in a different way. Being really open in our minds to different types of uses and different types of buildings and structures, and really starting to rethink it in terms of a place which isn't necessarily about retail, but about communities coming together. And that might be housing, it might be green space, it might be training and education, but really kind of being open to all the sorts of possibilities that town centres have, and really sort of working together and leaning very much on civil society to come up with those ideas, and not sort of assuming that there has to be a top-down approach that will magically solve all the issues in the longer term.
Thanks. Yeah, some really, really great points there. And I wanted to echo one of them before I introduced somebody else, which was about the availability of green space. And I think that something that Make's been working on is obviously the garden at Make Hamilton, in Birkenhead Town Centre, and just redefining what is meant by green space. Like, it doesn't just have to be like grass verges or like a whole park. We're just talking about a place where people can go, and softening of that urban environment, and creating a free opportunity for people to be somewhere and engage with people. That's actually been the most heartbreaking thing for Make over the past couple of weeks, is that every Sunday I cycle to Make Hamilton and sit in the garden, and it's just so beautiful, and it's just such a shame that other people can't share in that at the moment. Okay, so Paul, would you go next?
Thank you, Liam. So good afternoon. I'm Paul Kallee-Grover. I'm a director in Avison Young's Liverpool office, where I deliver strategic development management and planning services to private and public sector clients. So those of you not familiar with Avison Young, we're a full service commercial real estate business. We offer a comprehensive suite of commercial real estate services, the normal transaction management, financial and advisory. And we advise and assist our clients on every aspect of retail property. And our nationwide services embrace the whole life cycle from planning through to sales when we're talking about retailing. So I think even before COVID-19, we were seeing forces shaping the sector which were not just confined to the high street itself. We're also seeing changes to shopping centres, retail parks, cinemas, gyms, restaurants. All these were shifting and responding really to changes in consumer needs, but also consumer expectations. So we believe that COVID-19 is going to accelerate those structural changes that are already taking place in the UK retail sector. And these changes, I believe, are going to be felt more acutely on the high street than any other part of that sector. So, as I mentioned, long before the current COVID-19 health crisis, the UK retail market was already undergoing deep structural changes. So, changing consumer behaviour, rapid expansion of online retail, these were all posing challenges to retailers and owners of real estate, high streets, town centres. The very work that you sort of have been referencing just then about the setting up of these commissions to look at how we look at our high streets in the future, this was responding to that change. We're already seeing capital and revenue values falling across most retail segments and markets across the whole of the UK, with leasing and investment volumes falling on where they were last year. So that was already happening before COVID-19 came in. And sort of the evidence that we have from previous sort of epidemics, not of this scale, was that it's not the major economic impacts that come from these sorts of diseases aren't necessarily the disease itself, but the government's containment measures in terms of how we respond. So again, this is about the retail sector, and given that consumer spending in the UK accounts for about a third of our economy, you can see the impact that we've had from the lockdown that's now been in place for the last 4 weeks, and sort of the pressures that are coming back, not just for people to be able to get out and socialise and start shopping again, but how important that is for the economy as a whole. So it's too early right now to predict sort of a long-term impact of the current crisis on the market. And I think over the next few months, as we start seeing some of the restrictions start to lift, we'll start seeing some of that trade start to return. But I think, again, we're starting to see that happen at the big out-of-town, larger retail units, not therefore benefiting the town centres themselves. Sort of evidence that we've been gathering from conversations in Liverpool and work that we're doing on the likes of County Road and other parts of the city at the moment is that we're finding that people, probably for the first time in quite a while, are engaging with their local district centres, engaging with their local retailers, because they are businesses that they can walk to. They are businesses that are supporting them. And we'd like to think that in a post-COVID-19 world, people remember those businesses that they've been using and have supported them through this time. Their local butcher, their local greengrocers, the local bakers that have been actually not just supplying goods and services immediately in their areas, but they've been going out and forming groups to actually go and support businesses. And I'd like to think that, you know, we're seeing a step change through COVID-19 about the giving back and the community basis of retailers. So as I mentioned, when we're seeing a response and we're seeing businesses bounce back, I think there are businesses, especially smaller independent businesses, providing they've been able to survive this period through business rate relief or tax or even in furloughing some of their staff, that they should be well placed to bounce back in the community. So I think it's a slightly different angle, and certainly something I'd like to expand a bit more through this talk.
Yeah, no, that's really great, and I'm definitely one of those people that's I've used my butcher up the road. Don't eat a lot of meat, but but we do from time to time. And I walked up to the top of the road and bought meat from the butcher, like my mum used to when I was a kid. And that was definitely the first time I've ever done that whilst living in this house. And
something you'll continue to do, hopefully, after.
I hope so. But what I will say before give the floor to Vidhya is that I've also really enjoyed riding my bike. My partner's ridden her bike the most that she's ever ridden her bike before, because for her it was about building the confidence on the roads and stuff, and the quiet at the moment, and that's great. So obviously there's a public realm challenge around our rubbish bike infrastructure and then taking advantage of that, and so that people can feel confident to stay on their bikes. But I know from my own habits that I've been enthusiastic about biking before, and then it's eventually weaned away to the convenience of just driving my car to work. And I feel like the challenge is for us to not have a snapback that undoes a lot of the good that's come out of this. But before I yabber on, Vidhya, would you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your topics?
Yeah, thank you, Liam, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this. Actually, you've just set me up perfectly, so thank you, because I wanted to talk about building back, so I'll come on to that. But just to give you a quick overview of who I am, so I run an organisation called Power to Change. We're an independent trust set up in 2015 to support community businesses, and we define those as sort of locally rooted businesses that trade for the benefit of their community. And we've been really fortunate to support many community businesses that are playing an active role in the revival of their local high street or town centre, often working with other small businesses in doing that. And I think it's very apt for this conversation that we're being hosted by Make, who are doing absolutely that with Make Hamilton Square in Birkenhead, which I was lucky enough to see, I think, the week before lockdown, possibly. I was going to sort of use some data but I think Paul's kind of really covered sort of the depth of this crisis, but I did want to flag, for those of you who haven't seen it, there was some fantastic data published last week by Tortoise Media, which is a new media company that focuses on sort of slow news and working with the social investment business, which looked at falls in kind of consumer spending based on bank account data in different parts of the country. And it's really, I mean, quite staggering. I think in some of the places most badly affected are sort of small tourist towns. So in Penrith in Cumbria and Penzance in Cornwall, for example, they found that consumer spending is down by 82 and 85% respectively, because of the loss of tourists. And we know that many of the businesses that make up the town centre currently will take quite a long time to reopen, even if lockdown, as we're currently experiencing it, is eased to some extent. The likes of pubs and restaurants will sort of be at the back of the queue in terms of returning to any sort of pre-COVID era. So I think, I was lucky enough to be on the government's high street expert panel in 2018, and we were already concerned about high streets then and have been ever since. I think those concerns can only be, massively magnified now. But I wanted to really focus, as Liam started to sketch out, I've been involved, and I'm sure you all are too, in lots of conversations. They seem to be mushrooming at the moment about how we build back better, and how we intentionally create something different out of this crisis. And I think Sarah sort of alluded to it at the beginning. I feel like the crisis is big enough that it does create an opportunity to think differently, and we have to seize that opportunity for town centres. So I wanted to, in sort of preparing for this, I started to think through what that might mean. So I wanted to set out 4 principles for how we might build back better for town centres coming out of COVID-19. So the first is for town centres to be more civic rather than commercial spaces. And we already, before COVID, had started to think about the need for town centres to be mixed use. And I think we just need to go further with that and reimagine them as civic spaces. So for me, that means that their beating heart is as much about community and public services as it is about retail and leisure. I think after months of being isolated from each other, we will need town centres to be spaces where we can come together and find common purpose, and we can reimagine their use. So I think there's real opportunities to use some of the empty retail spaces that we'll inevitably have to house some of the amazing community organisations, both new and established, that have emerged out of this crisis and led a lot of the local response. Let's have them at the heart of our town centres. The same for public services. Let's put more GP surgeries, more health centres in empty shops, more daytime activities for older people, for other people who need support in former department stores. I think as part of this vision, I see very much, you won't be surprised to know, community business and other social enterprises can play a major role. They've got a strong track record of taking on assets, running them successfully, generating incomes through them and rebuilding pride in place. Make Hamilton Square is a great example of that at the beginning of its journey. Radcliffe Market Hall in Bury, another great example. Nudge Community Builders in Plymouth. I mean, I could give you lots and lots of examples, but there's a real potential to build a much more civic vision for what town centres look like, and the role, therefore, that social purpose organisations can play at the heart of that. I think the second principle, and Paul sort of started to talk about this already, is that I think high streets need to be more local. And one of the real glimmers of hope that comes out of the tortoise analysis that I referred to is that the businesses that are relying on local customers are the ones, unsurprisingly, that are faring best because of the restrictions that we're all under in terms of travel. So they find that the strongest indicator of how well a neighbourhood's businesses will do is what share of its old customer base live nearby. So shops that rely on customers who travel more than a mile to get to them are doing particularly badly. I think as with more and more retail chains going into administration, local businesses, both social purpose and not, will be the way of rebuilding town centres. And we know sort of from research that that's a lot of what people want. So as part of the High Street Expert Panel, we did lots of focus groups in various parts of the country, and it was a very consistent finding that what people wanted from the high street was independence and diversity. And if you look at the high streets that consistently win the government's Great British High Street Award, they are high streets that sort of typify that, like Crickhowell in Wales, with lots and lots of independent businesses on the high street and a real diversity. So a real move away from kind of chain retail, and that's just been accelerated by this crisis. And I think we see kind of coming out of the crisis some glimmers of possibility here. So I know Sally Ann's on the call, so she could probably say more about this, but talking to her about what's happening in Anfield around home baked, and talking to some of the community businesses we work with in Brighton who've been at the forefront of the emergency response, many of them have struggled to source food from traditional wholesalers who have prioritised the larger supermarkets. So they've started to develop new locally sourced supply chains. And if we can build on some of that, I think we can start to bring back some small independent shops to the high streets, and not just in affluent areas selling, soda bread for £5, but, in all of our communities. I think for me, the third principle is around kind of shared governance with community organisations firmly at the table and part of the strategic approach to tackling the challenges of the town centre. So I'll just give you a quick story, which isn't specifically high street related, but I think it kind of makes the point well as to how things normally work. So Lawrence Hill is a part of Bristol that's one of the most deprived parts of the city. There's a really long-standing, very experienced and deeply trusted local organisation called Wellspring Settlement that is right at the heart of meeting the needs of that local community, and it's played a critical part on behalf of the council of leading the emergency response, making sure people are fed, etc. But when the council got together to decide how its emergency response was going to happen, although it intended for Wellspring Settlement to be part of that response, Wellspring Settlement weren't around the table. So somebody else decided on their behalf that they should be part of the plan. And the reason I give you that example is because it's, in our experience, it's all too often how things work. And I think what the crisis has revealed is that community organisations and civil society has been central to how our towns and cities have functioned in this crisis. They are the people with the local knowledge that have led a lot of the response to vulnerability. If we don't bring them to the table as part of how we recover from this crisis, we're missing a massive source, I think, of expertise, of solutions, of knowledge. So we really need to change sort of the governance around around sort of decisions on the high street and town centres. So we're starting to look at the scope for building on what I think has been a really successful in many places model around business improvement districts, and creating community improvement districts, which could widen the governance and bring all the related parties together. I think if we want the high street to be as much about leisure and hospitality and retail as it is about public services and housing as much, and also about civic and community spaces, then I think all of those actors need to come together. And in my experience, that doesn't happen enough to get all of the voices strategically involved in how we shape the vision going forward. And then finally, the fourth principle, I think, Liam, you've already talked about it, is really to make the revival of the high street climate positive. So it's one of the positive things that's come out of COVID is the environmental impact, or the environmental impact that we're now having with less travel, we just had a team meeting earlier today, and somebody described it as, we've given nature a bit of a break and a time to recover. And we have to surely, knowing what we know about climate change, find ways to build back and hardwire a concern for climate into the future design of town centres, whether that's greater incentives for walking and cycling, more public transport, and critically more green space. And I think it's interesting that so many conversations that I've been in the last few years about town centres have been about parking, whether local authorities should stop charging for parking or not. I think we have to use this massive disruption of the crisis to plan for something better. So those would be my 4 principles, and I look forward to hearing what others think about that as a way forward.
Great, thank you. That's really, really comprehensive, and also it's the kind of solutions focused conversations that need to be had. I think there's a lot of hot air from some very important people at the moment leading this country, and actually, really we can put across those arguments, but also at the same time potential solutions. So thank you for always being solution focused, Vidhya. It's really appreciated. So I'm going to pick up a point. I'm going to read something from the chat and answer one of the questions that's in there. So Vidhya, Paul, and Sarah, please take this opportunity to look at the Q&A and pick out any of the things that you want to respond to, and I'll come back to you after I finish my point. So I just very specifically want to talk about that final point that you made about climate change, and also the really boring conversation about parking. It's an undisputable fact that parking provision in the very, very short term has affected the use of town centres and high streets. So that's mostly because of the habits that people have about the convenience of being able to get somewhere quick, and everyone wants to be able to park and all that sort of stuff, coupled with public transport not really supplying the convenience that everyone has come to expect. And the challenge, that the reason why public transport doesn't do that is because we don't have person density to make it a viable, economically viable thing to have. So all the cities that do this really well, New York, London, Singapore, extremely densely populated cities, and public transport can run in a market economy very, very well in those situations. Also, massively subsidized, often TfL, etc. And so we can't escape this conversation about parking, but at the same time, it seems like an oxymoron to be talking about that at the same time that we want to improve climate change. And I think that this often comes because we're not centering the conversation around the issue. The issue isn't that people drive. The issue is that we use fossil fuels. The issue is that in the supply chain, it's not carbon neutral. People, I think, will always want personal automated vehicles of some description, currently cars, potentially something else in the future, to conveniently get from A to B, and that potentially won't be a change in our habit. And really, that's one of the big conversations that we need to be having about what's the future look like where we're not using fossil fuels, rather than what's the future look like where we're all not using cars. And the specific question that was asked in the chat was a very, very good point, actually. So John Telfer said, bikes can cause difficulties for many disabled people. And as a person who cycled all of my life, I used to ride a BMX when I was a kid. I used to ride the pavement, and I can empathize at that point 100%, John. I think you're right. Like non-walking, skateboarding, bikes, etc., do cause problems for people, and terrible parking also causes problems for disabled people in our town centres and around the high streets. And I think it's really because priority is given to big wide roads and big wide pavements, and there just aren't enough protected cycle routes. And I know that there's a challenge about having them in place, but that's where it comes down to people like Paul and the role that you're in. Avison Young, CBRE, all those organisations will always be consulted on by councils. And I don't need to convince you. You're not the individual person that's targeted at, but making sure that people are around the table, like Vidhya said, from the social sector, etc., and making sure that those conversations and points about protected cycle lanes and all that sort of stuff, your organizations are the ones that often have the biggest voice in those, because you're trusted in that way by the decision makers, which is fair. So Paul, Vidhya, Sarah, are there any questions or points that people have made that you want to pick up on?
I was going to come back on the car parking one, and I think John's raised something else on that. And again, car parking itself, and when you're talking about a town centre or a shopping centre, are drivers, pardon the pun, but in terms of revenue generators, and that's what they're seen as. Some of the evidence that we've been looking at and working in Liverpool specifically, actually the amount of spend that you get by people who come in through public transport can be considerably higher per head than those who are coming in by car. If you come in by car and you park in any one of our major cities, you're looking easily at £15-20 to park for the day, and that's money that just goes straight back into either to the retail provider or to the town. Whereas if you're coming in by public transport, you're more likely to spend longer because you're less conscious of the hours clicking away, which are costing you £4 or £5 an hour to park. You're more likely as a family to stay and have food and drink, because again, you're not being driven necessarily to have to then get back in a car and drive home. So I think it's about how we retell some of that messaging. Yes, there is an impact on revenues if car parking drops off, but actually the people that are there, if they're spending more, does that then counter some of the potential loss? And again, this is something that's always in flux, but certainly an area that's worth exploring further, I think.
Great. Vidhya, Sarah?
Yeah, I'll pick up two things. And they're related, I think. So one is around sort of, so John, so I can't remember who it was on the Q&A, said, the problem with it is independents can't afford to be in town centres. I think that has been true in some places, but I think the crisis with reduced property values and what will inevitably have to be lower rents gives us an opportunity. And I think we have to start to learn from the places that are managing to, like Crickhowell in Wales, like that are managing to do this, to understand what proactive role local authorities can play to create the kind of high street that we want. I think the reality is this doesn't happen by accident. If we want it to be different, we have to curate it differently. We have to intentionally create this future that we want. It's not going to happen because the market is going to make this happen. We have to be more proactive, and that sort of relates to the ownership point. So we did some research last year which found that roll back. One of the fundamental challenges in town centres in the UK is that there is fragmented ownership. So there's lots of people who own different buildings in many places, and many of them are absent. So they're either institutional landlords or they're overseas landlords. So it's very difficult to curate the high street in some places because of that. The research that we did last year suggested that high street properties that are in public or community ownership are much less likely to be empty. So there's a much greater incentive if you're a public or community owner, because you're sort of rooted in that place, to actually keep the property empty, keep the property full, because you're not as interested in the capital growth as you are in actually a vibrant town centre. So I think we have to, money is going to be incredibly tight for local authorities and central government, but I do think there's an opportunity with lower values to think about how we get more properties into public and community ownership. So I'm really hoping that there will still be opportunities. The government committed, for example, to create a community ownership fund prior to COVID-19 in its manifesto. Those are the kinds of opportunities that may end up being thrown by the wayside because public money is going to be so tight after all of the stimulus spending. But I think this is a real, this is a kind of invest to save moment where we could get more properties into community and public ownership at this point when they're going to be as affordable as they'll ever be, probably. So I really hope that there are opportunities for both local authorities and central government to take it on.
Yeah, definitely echo that point, Vidhya. Make specifically, but also a lot of the organisations that we've been working with have taken that view completely. Obviously, as an organisation, we're not in a position to go out and get a loan or use our own cash to buy up property, but we are having conversations with the local authority about a persistent problem that they've had in 10 Streets, which is that they don't own enough property to have influence and the local authorities seem to understand that. Sefton and Wirral Council both intervening in their markets sort of shows that they understand that importance for the high street and for town centres, that if they don't own the heart of it, they can't really influence it. Like their influence is limited by just the public realm, and really that's not enough. And I'm a big believer in that Mark Twain quote, buy land, they're not making any more of it. And if there's an opportunity now, the change makers are the ones that really need to be in control of the land. Sarah, did you have any points that you wanted to come in on?
Yeah, I think Paul and Vidhya have covered a lot of them very, very comprehensively. I think I would just say on the point that Carol, I think, made about trying to make the case for community-led businesses. I would imagine that this crisis will provide opportunities for a much greater say for civil society organisations to be able to say, look, at the minute, parts of the town centre and the sort of more traditional uses have been really badly affected. And I think it'll become increasingly difficult for councils and bids to push back against community-led businesses. So I think, as Vidhya said, there's a chance to try and build back better and show what community-led business can do. And I think there's loads just in this question and answer. There's some really great examples of how that can happen. So I think that's a real kind of hope for the future. There's also a point in there about funding, and I think it's quite interesting that a lot. You and me have talked about this, Liam, that a lot of the funding so far has been quite capital based for town centres from government. And I think there is a real need to recognise that revenue funding, so money that you don't necessarily have to spend on a building or on a piece of equipment, but just money to employ someone, money to purchase a piece of equipment or whatever, sort of micro grants actually can do a lot to actually animate the town centre space. And so I would like to see a greater emphasis from government on smaller pots of money that are easily accessible for community organisations, because I think actually that can go a long way, and it can really help to enable people to try different things out and to experiment. And I think that sort of a need to experiment and try stuff out is going to be really important in this crisis, because there's going to be a real variety of responses in terms of how this plays out. Some places will probably be okay, and I think local shops and local community organisations will help the town centres to fight back, but in other areas will be really severely affected. So I think we do need to recognise the role of those smaller initiatives. And then I think finally, just in terms of the point about ownership, I would absolutely agree with Vidhya on community asset transfer. Trying to make sure that if there are community organisations out there who are able to take on buildings and shop fronts, and that they aren't just simply being dumped on, if you like, that they actually have they are a growing concern, then they should be given the chance to do that in this kind of crisis. Because as I said at the start, I think we do need to be thinking much more radically about the way in which town centres operate, and ownership, I think, is a really important part of that to be in. I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that we have to have a sort of big scale solution for ownership. And actually, I think a lot of the time it's just about diversifying that ownership and giving community organisations a chance to show what they can do as well. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you very much. Just cover off a few of the questions that are in there. Jane Dorr from SAFE has sort of shared the status of what Destination Bootl's up to, and I think that's such a good example of what a community business can do. They've been around for a very long time, but they had humble roots like a lot of the community businesses and creative-led organisations, and they can show really what can be done, and I think that's a great example. And that they, to sort of like segue into that point that Sarah was just making, they started off just like Make did, with very, very little money, and actually, that need for revenue support, I think, is critical. Giving people the chance to test their ideas and having an appetite for failure, and not viewing failure as the etymology of like it being the end, but actually the failure is often the beginning of something new. And then the last one I'll read out from the Q&A was a point that somebody made to sort of further the point that I was making. So she said public transport routes are often not designed to reflect lifestyle needs, especially for women who are often the carers of families and such, and that multi-stage journeys are often a challenge. And I think I personally think that's a huge barrier with buses. And whether or not a world post-COVID needs to focus on the challenges that those people are going to face. So just for some final thoughts from you all, but and try and focus it a little bit on the response to COVID, and perhaps what needs to be done in the next 6 to 12 months. Don't expect massive answers, but yeah. Paul, if you could go first, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think as I mentioned before, we're already seeing a weaker sort of food retailers and sort of restaurants and things failing before we entered into COVID-19, and we're expecting that to be accelerating. And I think as we come out the other side, what we had been seeing as a success in high streets and town centres around the UK was the pop-up food, the pop-up restaurants, the smaller sort of the market feel food courts that have enabled the sort of the regeneration of Altrincham or areas of Leeds or places in Bristol. I think if we can see more of that, and if we are seeing failed restaurants that aren't reopening, that there's a way to step in and start using this, because they come with fully equipped kitchens and other businesses. So is there an opportunity then with some of the national failures in restaurants, and as I think as we mentioned before, the Jamie's Italian and Zizi and some of these other, those units now stand empty. Can we look at trying to bring smaller independent businesses into those to trial as small independent restaurants, and then hopefully build up a local business and expand from that? So I think that might be something that COVID has providing an opportunity as we come out and see some businesses that haven't succeeded. How do we move in on those empty units effectively?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Sarah, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo a lot of what Paul's just said. I think someone's just asked a question about kind of meanwhile spaces, and I think that anything we can do to make town centre space flexible and open at this time is really important, because and I think it's been quite striking actually looking at how the government have been flexible in terms of allowing restaurants and pubs to do takeaway quite almost overnight when COVID began. That previously they wouldn't be able to do that, but overnight they were government were able to flex its muscles and make sure that the legislation was there to allow those organisations to do that. So I think we need much more of that kind of flexible approach and much more kind of freeing up of ideas and local entrepreneurship to be able to try some of those new things out. And I think one of the interesting things about this crisis is it has really brought home the importance of digital connectivity, and there's a real opportunity. We talked about it at the Town Centres Commission to think about town centres as a lot of empty shops as training spaces for local community organisations to make sure that everybody can get online and can take advantage of that opportunity, as well as the provision of flexible business space for people who perhaps want to choose to work at home from now on, but would also like the chance to meet other people and to take advantage of local meeting spaces for their work. So I think really just trying to be flexible and being open and trying to think about town centres in a much more radically different way than has hitherto been the case. I think that kind of that way of thinking about places is going to be really important in the future. I think it'll be interesting to see how the government decide to revise some of their high street initiatives and funds, and whether they decide to make those a little bit more flexible and less focused on capital. And I think they're going to be part of the solution. But I think that the main thing going forward is really echoing Vidhya's point about making town centres a much more civic space And as part of that, recovery from COVID, that chance for people to meet again and to reconnect as part of a community, I think that's a really positive and encouraging idea in terms of how we can support town centres going forward.
Great, thank you very much. And as you say, it turns out that internet connection is a utility after all. Vidhya, your final points.
Yeah, I'm conscious we're running out of time, so I'll keep it brief. I think I'll just pick up 3 things, and they've all been mentioned by others already. So I think Sarah's point about revenue is critical. I think we need to combine revenue, so small grants, etc., with experimentation. None of us know how to, we've never been here before, and none of us know how to do this. So experimentation and rapid learning need to be a big part of how we go forward. And then ownership, I think is a really interesting post by Sally-Ann. So Sally-Ann Watkis at Home Baked was one of the judges on the Great British High Street, and she sort of picks up the point we were talking about around ownership and says, one of the interesting things about Crick Howell, which won a couple of years ago, was that none of the buildings on the high street were owned by absent landlords. They were all locally or community owned, and I think that tells us something powerful.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing I would say is it feels like we're largely agreeing with each other. So who is it that we need to convince about this vision of the high street that we seem to be all violently agreeing about? Who's not in this conversation, and who should we be talking to, I think is the question I'm left with. It's lovely to be in a conversation where most people think that this is the way forward, but clearly that's not the majority view. So who or it wasn't, maybe that's shifting. So who else do we need to talk to, I think is what I'm left wondering. And
this is why you're in charge, Vidhya. Thank you for making that very tangible and actionable point there. You're totally right. Who do we all now need to go and lobby and all that sort of stuff? And I genuinely think that organizations like Paul's have a massive role to play in that. Trusted organizations like Avison Young and CBRE, et cetera, if you're saying these things, then it gives us some hope. Thank you very much, everybody, for your thoughts and all that sort of stuff. We will share this recording on YouTube as quickly as we can, and direct any questions that have been left over with you and all that. So thank you for your time. Really, really appreciated.